Alright guys, so we're going to pick up now with our last chapter on the animals, and that's going to be the chordates, but really quite large emphasis on the vertebrates as kind of the primary group of chordates, because of course vertebrates includes fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, species in general, groups in general that people tend to have kind of a, if not a fascination, at least a general kind of waning interest in those groups. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time on those, but before we get to them, we're going to talk about the basics, the kind of entry-level criteria for animals that are classified as chordates. So chordates, of course, are the other deuterostome group, along with the echinoderms. Chordates are coelomates and deuterostomes, so along with that, kind of going back a couple chapters, radial cleavage, indeterminate developments, blastopore that becomes the anus, complex coelom formation, etc. So the chordates and the echinoderms were kind of our two big groups of deuterostomes. So I mentioned a second ago, there are fishes, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, although, a couple points about that. First off, and I think I mentioned before, fishes is a correct term as long as you're talking about more than one species. Fishes is actually grammatically correct, or at least scientifically correct in this case. And really, the idea, the concept of splitting birds and reptiles apart from each other is really a false one. More up-to-date textbooks now, maybe written within the past, 5 years or so, classify the birds with the reptiles, and that's a very accurate, actually, thing to do because they are a side group of the reptiles. Considering the birds separate from reptiles is a very artificial kind of classification scheme because they are a side branch of the reptiles. So to be a chordate, there are four characteristics that we're going to talk about that all chordates have. Now, this is actually a pretty big phylum. We talked about, of course, the arthropods were the really big group, and then we talked about the mollusks, which were the second biggest group. The chordates actually are the third biggest group by number of species, although, again, that's a little bit artificial because this group is more well-studied than any other group. It kind of makes sense that there are going to be a lot of species. Now, that being said, there probably aren't that many more species out there waiting to be described or discovered. I'm sure there are definitely some. There's probably a few thousand that haven't been discovered yet, of maybe fishes especially. But it's not like we're going to see millions and millions more chordates discovered anytime soon or ever. Whereas arthropods are still, they're discovering thousands of new species per year and adding those to what we know about the arthropods. So this group is big, but it's also kind of like tapped out as far as how much diversity is actually there. We kind of know the group pretty well. The four traits I mentioned a second ago, to be a chordate, and this is one of those things too where it has to be at some point during the life. So even though an animal might have a trait and lose it over time, it still counts. So just like we talked before, all the way back in the beginning of the course, we said that if an animal is bilaterally symmetrical even for a day, we classify it as bilateral. If an animal has these four characteristics at some point during its life, even for a day, we still classify them as being chordates. All right, so number one, chordates have to have a nerve cord. Now, the nerve cord in the case of the vertebrates becomes a spinal cord. Now, this is a point of clarification that I always like to make because there's always a lot of confusion about this. The spinal cord is very different from the spine. All right, the spine is made of vertebrae, which are bones. The spinal cord is made of nervous tissue. All right, very, very different stuff. So if you're talking about a spinal cord, make sure you say spinal cord. All right. Now, the second characteristic that all chordates have at some point during their lives is a notochord. Now, the notochord is in the invertebrate chordates, those that don't have vertebrae. It's typically just kind of like a flexible rod. Right here, we see it in this embryo of whatever this happens to be. This flexible rod is going to give support to the nerve cord, which is just dorsal to it. And therefore, you've got some structural support. You've got some a little bit of protection there, etc., to help kind of support that spinal cord. So, again, if we're talking about vertebrates, the vertebrae, and again, spine, but not spinal cord, the spine is produced from the notochord. The notochord calcifies and gives rise to vertebrae, which then make up the backbone of the animal. All chordates at some point during their lives have pharyngeal gill slits. Now, this is something where, like in this picture, and I should mention too, this picture really could be almost any chordate. It looks a little bit more like a vertebrate, but really any chordate in the embryonic stage is going to have this basic kind of appearance. So this could be a gorilla, this could be a lizard, this could be a fish, this could be you when you were little. It was you when you were little. You look like this, very, very small. So those were there as well. Now, whereas the nerve cord and notochord, we kind of see where those come into play in the adult form. We can kind of relate to our own spinal cord. We can relate to our backbone. But as far as pharyngeal gill slits, I mean, if you kind of feel around on your neck, right, you're not going to feel any gills there, I guess. So I'm assuming. In the embryonic development that you went through, you actually eliminated most of your pharyngeal gill slits, and the anteriormost gill slits actually became part of the inner ear. The eustachian tubes were formed actually from the pharyngeal pouches there at the kind of the front end, the anterior end of the animal. The back ones are kind of lost as development occurs. The fourth trait that all chordates have is a post-anal tail. Right? So the post-anal tail, again, this is something which, you can sort of, I guess, check yourself out and see if you have a post-anal tail, but you don't, I'm assuming. So where did it go? Right? So as an embryo, your post-anal tail was largely reabsorbed. Most of it went away. It was taken back into the body, and those nutrients were used for other things, except for a couple of little vertebrae all the way at the end of your backbone that's referred to as the coccyx. Now, most people are going to have either 4 or 5 segments there, but they are fused together into one structure, your tailbone. And so this is what we refer to as a vestigial trait. If we look at a human embryo in 6, 7, 8 weeks after fertilization, it's got a post-anal tail, but it's very rapidly going away by that point in time. And by 8 weeks, it's going to be pretty much gone, except for the internal parts which make up the coccyx. So it's a trait that our ancestors had. It's a trait that some of our kind of close relatives still have, but not a trait that we really use for very much in our case. About the only time you realize you have a tailbone is if you happen to bruise it or break it, which is, believe me, not very pleasant, but otherwise most of us don't think too much about our coccyx. All right, some other characteristics that are not always found in chordates, but are usually found in chordates, are somites. A lot of chordates have muscles arranged this way, where we have actual blocks of muscle tissue, and really kind of the easiest way to relate to it, I mean, we can see it in this picture here. This is called a lancelet. This is a cephalochordate, and these little segments here are the somites. But probably an easier thing to relate to is if you've ever eaten fish, right? Fish is always kind of flaky, right? And that flesh of the fish, the flaky flesh of the fish, if you say that 5 times fast, good for you. That flaky tissue represents the somites of that particular animal, right? The muscle tissue is arranged in those blocks, and if you cook fish and pick it up with a fork, those somites come apart, and that's actually what you're eating. So we see that there. Our muscles don't really kind of work that way, but in a very loose sense, they kind of do. Chordates also have an internal skeleton. Of course, vertebrates have a bony skeleton. Almost all vertebrates have that, as we'll talk about. But the other two groups of invertebrate chordates are going to have other kinds of structures for their internal support. So within the phylum Chordata, we now have 3 subphyla. We have the Urochordata, we have the Cephalochordata, and we have the Vertebrata. So the Urochordata and Cephalochordata are both invertebrates in that they don't have a backbone of any kind. They still have a spinal cord, but that's not the same thing as a backbone. And so they are invertebrate chordates. The vertebrates, on the other hand, obviously have vertebrae, and so that's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time in this chapter, is talking about the vertebrates. So we'll start with the Urochordates because they're kind of the most, they're the oddball here. They're the odd man out. They're the ones that are least like the other two groups of cephalochordates and vertebrates. The Urochordata are typically referred to as either tunicates or sea squirts. Salps, I believe, is more of like a European sort of common name for them, which is used by British and so forth scientists. I just call them tunicates. I've heard people call them sea squirts, but that's kind of, I guess, your preference there. Not a very big group. Subphylum with only 1,250 species is not a very big subphylum. No bones of any kind, no vertebrae. This group, I mean, this picture down here at the bottom of this slide illustrates very nicely what a typical colony of tunicates looks like. They look like sponges to me. I mean, they've got each one, if you pick one out here, like this guy right here. This one has these 2 little openings, and you might imagine water coming into the body of this animal somehow and going out through one of these other openings. That's really what they do. They filter feed a lot like a sponge does, as we'll see here in a second. We'll look at some internal anatomy as well, but they're much more complicated than a sponge. Right? They have tissues, they have organ systems. They're far, far more complicated than any sponge ever imagined to be, if a sponge could imagine anything. So they are very complex, even though they look like simpler animals. Now, the juvenile stage of the tunicate looks a lot like either a tadpole or maybe a fish, And it's actually the larval stage that has all four of those chordate traits. The adult form doesn't have the notochord or nerve cord, even though it does have the pharyngeal gill slits. It doesn't have a postanal tail either. That's not on the slide. But the adult form loses some of those traits, even though the juvenile form has all four of those traits. The juvenile form is so short-lived that it doesn't even feed. In fact, it doesn't have a mouth. It doesn't have an intestine or any sort of digestive tract. The larval form of a tunicate is very, very temporary. And if it doesn't find a spot to settle down and attach so it can start feeding, it's going to die after hardly any time at all. The adults, again, don't have a body cavity, don't have any kind of segmentation whatsoever. They are filter feeders. In a very loose sense, it's kind of like a cross almost between like a bivalve and a sponge, right? They've got the shape of the sponge, but they have the two siphons like a mollusk would have, like a bivalve would have, a clam or an oyster or whatever. So it's kind of like a loosely, sort of a cross between those two groups. The outer surface of the tunicate is the tunic. And a tunic is sort of an uncommon sort of a shirt, sort of like a long shirt that people used to wear back in the day. And for some reason, at some point in time, people named the outer layer of the Chordata a tunic. And what's interesting about that tunic is that it can actually be made out of cellulose, which is a bit unusual because typically we think of cellulose being produced by plants, but this is actually an animal that's capable of producing a little bit of cellulose in the tunic to give it some structural support and some toughness on the outside of its body. So this picture here, we talked about before, the larvae have all four of the chordate traits, but they turn into something like we see in this picture here. So in this picture, we have an incurrent siphon where water is coming in. There is the pharynx, right? Pharynx we talked about several times back in our survey of the animals. It's a feeding mouth part sort of a structure. This pharynx is equipped with gill slits, which serve as a filter. And when water is brought into the incurrent siphon, whatever food particles might be present are passed through the filter and into the stomach and eventually the intestine and so forth. The water is then funneled out the excurrent siphon into the outside environment. So they're feeding a lot like a bivalve with the incurrent and excurrent siphon, and they're filter feeding like other groups we've seen as well. Let's see. So we talked about basically all those traits. I don't think we need to go back through those anymore, but pretty characteristic for a Urochordata. These things can be different colors. I've seen them in kind of like that blue color you see in the picture on the bottom right. I've seen like light purple or orange. There's all different kinds of, usually kind of pastel sort of colors, but kind of pretty in their own right, I guess. Find these a lot if you're snorkeling or scuba diving around mangrove swamps. They like to attach to the roots of the mangroves. And they're kind of part of the little community there among the mangroves, which is a really, really diverse kind of a community. The second subphylum of the chordates is the Cephalochordata, and these are the lancelets. So the lancelets actually are the group that produced the vertebrates, including ourselves. So these, at least within the phylum Chordata, are our most distant ancestors. Even though they don't look like us very much, this is the group that produced the fishes. The fishes gave rise to amphibians, which then gave rise to reptiles, which eventually produced the mammals. So these actually are one of our very, very, very distant ancestors that goes back probably around 500, 550 million years or so. Cephalochordates are also called lancelets. Now, a lancelet in medical terms is a type of surgical instrument that is actually pointed at both ends. It's sharp at both ends. So somebody back in the day, probably back in the 1700s or so, saw these organisms, saw they're pointed at both ends like a surgical lancelet is, and so they called them lancelets. These are very, very tiny things, always in the marine environment. Typically, I mean, this picture here really illustrates that your life, if you're a tunic, or I'm sorry, if you're a lancelet, you're buried in the sand, so you're somewhat protected against predators. They can't see you and they can't attack you if you're buried in the sand. And you've got your head exposed, feeding on whatever food particles might float by. So they're not really filter feeders, but they're just sort of like, grabbing opportunistically whatever food happens to come by in the water current. They have these little whiskers here, which they use to filter food particles out of the water. And then from there, it's passed on to their GI tract. This group of cephalochordates or lancelets does maintain all four of the chordate traits throughout its entire life. So they have the postanal tail, the notochord, the dorsal hollow nerve cord, and the pharyngeal gill slits all throughout their life. They are very, very thin-skinned. You can actually see their internal organs pretty clearly. Like in these pictures here, these little white dots, if you can make them out, those are actually somites. On the ventral side, you can barely see the somites on the back surface here as well, the muscle blocks back there as well. But no scales of any kind. Typically more gills than a fish has also. So typically fish will have, if it's a shark, it'll have anywhere between 4 to 6 gills on each side of its head. Bony fishes work differently, but they don't have anywhere near as many gills or gill slits as what a cephalochordate would have. So a lot more complexity there in the gill structure of these animals. I already talked about that. They spend a lot of time, like I said, buried in the substrate. They really don't have much of any sort of defense. They're not going to be fast. They're not armored. They can't bite or sting or fight back in any way. So they're just going to hide out as best they can in the substrate with just enough of their body exposed to grab those food particles as they float by. This picture up here illustrates those somites again really nicely. You can sort of imagine this being like a really, 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 really tiny salmon or something with a muscle tissue there. And this shows those gill slits very nicely as well. These are planktivorous animals. So they use those cilia, those what I called whiskers before, which help to generate a water current right around the face or the head. And that, then brings food particles nearby, which can be consumed. Amphioxus actually is a very, very common genus of cephalochordate. And this is another one of those cases where the genus name actually became a common name. It's not at all uncommon for people just to call any lancelet Amphioxus just because it's such a cosmopolitan group within this particular subphylum. So I've used that name kind of interchangeably with lancelet a few times, and it's not at all uncommon to do it that way. So from there, we're going to go into the vertebrates. I'm going to end this section here, and when I pick up, we're going to talk about some very general vertebrate traits, and we're going to move into and start talking about the fishes, both cartilaginous and bony fishes, and talk about some of the nomenclature there as well. And we'll try to get that pinned down too. So we're going to wrap this section up now, and we'll start up with section 2 in just a second.